For those of you who have missed last week, I'm not going to do a recap because there's children in the room. But let's just say we had a great conversation last week about things that happened between the sheets, and it was great. It was really good. In fact, probably one of my highlights was I was here at the student gathering as they closed things up Sunday night at the middle school gathering, and I was sitting back there on the back row, and they were just wrapping up, and they were taking communion together, and they were doing this thing where they were praying for one another. And one of these kids is in middle school. He comes over to me, and I was sitting right back there, and he was in the gathering. He's also in this gathering at this moment. I just saw him, and he was in the gathering. And so I'm not gonna say your name, but he came over to me, and he's like, Pastor Clint, your message was awesome this morning. And I was thinking, let's go. All right, you know what I'm saying? Let's get it. If you weren't here last week, you should go watch week 2 of our marriage series. We got into it. You know what I'm saying? We got into it. Week three, couples will come to me and they'll say, hey, will you marry us, right? And I always respond, I'm like, hey, that's really nice, but I'm already married and I'm not in the polygamy thing. Like, we're not gonna do those things, but that's not what they mean. They're like, say, hey, will you marry us? And I know what they mean. Like, hey, will you officiate our wedding, you know? And I love being a part of people's march or walk towards their wedding when they're a part of what we do as a community. I love it. I love it for a couple of reasons. I love it because I think it's an opportunity to make sure that they're given all of the tools and they're thinking through all of the things that I think are important to one of our values, which is healthy families. And so I get to be in on the front end of that, which is great. But the second thing is I love being a part of days that don't get ever redone, right? Like, you only get one wedding day, and like it only happens that one time. Like, you could renew some vows, something like that, but that one day only occurs once. And I love having the opportunity to stand in with someone on something that only occurs and happens one time in their entire life. That day never gets repeated, right? Like, I love being a part of those things. And I also love watching their family grow into what God wants for them. Like, that's a highlight of being a part of ministry. So I enjoy that whole thing. However, before we get to all the things that I love to do, right, which is be a part of those moments, there's a question that I ask them. It always starts with, all right, well, let me check my calendar, because usually they have a date in mind, and I want to make sure that there's nothing else that's already happening on that date that can't move or want to move or whatever that is. And so I check the calendar, and if the answer to the calendar is, okay, it's open, then I ask them a question. And it's always the same question. I say, hey, here's the deal. I don't know why you want me to marry you, right? Maybe you think it's because I'm just gonna be funny or something, or maybe it's gonna like aggravate your in-laws because they're super buttoned up tight and you know that I'm not, and so it's like, hey, we're just gonna stick it to them this way, you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know if that's it, but here's the deal. This is what matters, how you answer this question. Right? Here's the question. Do you want to be as spiritually healthy as you have ever been on your wedding day? If that's what you want, then I want to take this journey with you. But if that's not what you want, if you want one of the other things, like, you can just 1-800 rent a priest or something. Like, that's a real thing, you know? Like, you can do that. But that's the question I want to ask. Now, here's the thing. While I get to do that with couples before they get married and walk to them to that process, where hopefully they would be at a spiritual peak in their life thus far on their wedding day, I also get to sit with a lot of couples that didn't walk through those things, that have decided to give their lives to Jesus and they've been married for a while, or one of them in the relationship came to decide to give his life to Jesus or her life to Jesus later than the other. And so they're just at different places, and there's already a lot of habits and things that are built up that might not be spiritually healthy, but they're still asking the same question, like, how do we do this, right? And so when we think through that, I wanted to just ask the question, does the Bible give us any insight into establishing the importance or significance of spiritual health in our marriage health? And if we're gonna ask that question, I think the first place we have to start is not on the marriage side of things, but the personal side of things. How do we gauge our spiritual health? Like right now in your mind, if I were to ask you, hey, are you spiritually healthy? You might say it's a yes or no question. Or maybe some of you, like, is it like a scale, like a 10 to 1 scale? And would I find myself somewhere on a spectrum of spiritual health? I think those are all really good questions. Jesus says this. He's specifically talking about some false teachers, but we've been able to apply the principle here to almost anyone that we run into, whether it's in our relationships or the people we do business with. Followers of Jesus, this is a standard all of us would fall into. He says it in Matthew chapter 7. It says, by their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. And this principle applies to all of us. Like when we take a look at our life, we have the ability to say, hey, is what we're producing a positive thing? Is it a good thing? Or is it something that's bad? Is it a negative thing? Now, obviously, the lens that we look through it through a Jesus-following lens is a little different than the rest of the world. The rest of the world might look at something and say, man, that looks great. You know, he's got a bunch of nice cars, and that's really good. That must be good fruit. But the truth is, and maybe, well, let me back up. Maybe it's a struggle for us where we would see people that maybe we know aren't all that great of people, but they seem to be prospering. Like the fruit that they produce is successful. Their business is growing, right? And their bottom line, it's growing. And all the things that we want in our life is like, man, that looks so good. But the truth is that sometimes we can have fruit that looks great, but when we bite into it on the middle, it's rotten. And it's not until we take a closer inspection that we actually see what's really good and what's really bad. Is that doable for us in our marriage? What does good fruit look like in our marriage? What does good fruit look like in your personal life? He seems pretty adamant that a bad tree can't produce good fruit. Also pretty adamant, a good tree's not gonna produce bad fruit. By your fruit, you'll recognize them, he says. Well, that still leaves us a little ambiguous. It's like, well, like that's a good principle, right? But practically speaking, like what does that look like? Like, can we drill down a little better and just say, okay, well, good fruit, good tree, bad tree. That's very 30,000 foot level, you know? Like, can we kind of figure out how do we produce good fruit, right? Because maybe there's the secret. Maybe the secret is in how we produce the fruit. And if we figure out the how, the fruit will always be good. I think that's a logical thing. A really good friend of Jesus named John had an incredible perspective, and he actually writes a book that we are given in the New Testament. It's just entitled The Book of John, or the Gospel of John. And he says it this way, talking about fruit. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be more fruitful. Now, when I hear that, there's this theme that, hey, when we think about our spiritual lives, that there's this positive thing that ought to be coming from it, this positive fruit. But even if it's good fruit, what John is saying is that even if we produce good fruit, we're not perfect. He says, hey, not every branch is gonna produce good fruit in us. But the branches that are bearing no fruit at all, God's gonna cut off. And he also says that even if you have the ability to produce good fruit, if positive things are happening in your spiritual life, God's still gonna prune the positive things. Why? Because he's thinking a next season down the road. He's not only thinking about, hey, in this moment, are you producing good things? God's thinking about an eternal perspective, which begins today but continues on. And so as he thinks through and he looks at your life, and let's just say you get in a sweet spot where you feel like, man, things are really going well for me. Maybe it is in your marriage and it's spiritually. And in your life, it's like, man, I'm trucking along. I like this. And then all of a sudden, maybe something just doesn't go your way. All of a sudden, some obstacles begin to mount up. And you're wondering, you're like, hold on, why are things not going my way now? Like everything was on a direction that I liked, I was and approve of, rubber stamp, God, thank you for this life, thank you for my blessings. But now things are not going my way. That feels a little bit like pruning, because think about it. The more obstacles you overcome, even though you don't want to have to experience the obstacles again, haven't you gained so much? For those of you who have been through just enormous amounts of suffering or pain and you've come out the other side, aren't you actually better for it? Like, aren't you stronger inside of you? Don't you realize that I was made to do more than probably what I anticipated prior to going through with it? Haven't you learned a little bit more about perseverance and your ability to withstand all the things that can happen when life decides to life? That pruning simply makes it to where we can not only grow in this season, but it prepares us for growth in the season to come. When we think through how do we make sure this fruit happens, how do we ensure that we can be pruned, that we can actually see something grow from trials and difficulties? I think I want something a little more concrete. It still feels very theological, right? It just feels like theoretical even. Like, okay, good tree, good fruit, bad fruit. If there's no fruit, he cuts it off. If there's good fruit, he's gonna prune it. But specifically, what are we talking about? How do we make that happen? Like, Jesus, can you just clear it up? Like, let's stop talking about broad things. Can we get more specific? How do we get this good fruit? How do we position ourselves to actually be pruned in a season where we can experience even more growth in the next season? Well, that's the crazy thing, is he gives it to us. John 15:4-5, he says, remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I'm the vine. You are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Man, that is a sobering statement. Because now we've gone from something that's a little ambiguous, like, okay, we can kind of self-determine what's good fruit and bad fruit because he doesn't give us a lot of specifics. We can even imagine what pruning might be like. We can even maybe think of some circumstances where we are stronger because of obstacles and hiccups and bumps in the road along in our life, right? We can think of some of those things, but now we've got something very clear, very clear. This is not just good fruit, bad fruit, pruning, getting rid of the dead spots that aren't producing anything. No, he says, here's the deal. If you want to produce good fruit, you're going to have to remain in or hold on to the vine. Because if you want to produce good fruit, you need to be attached to Jesus. That it begins with your attachment to Jesus. Now, when we think through our lives, ultimately, that's one of the biggest questions we're going to ask this morning. Is how in the world do you attach yourself to Jesus? If that's the beginning of all good fruit, well, then it makes sense. It almost feels like if you can figure out your attachment to Jesus, the fruit takes care of itself. So that it doesn't matter that in this moment you can't picture the specifics of good fruit and bad fruit in your life. And maybe those of you who are further along in your spiritual journey, maybe you've got some pretty good images. But for some of you who are just getting started or thinking about getting started, you're like, I'm not even sure what spiritual fruit would look like. And I think that's important for us to recognize. Ultimately, we want to get to a place in our life where we simply say yes, sir, to when God presents us an opportunity. Because sometimes he will call us or allow us into moments that we never anticipated, fruit opportunities we never dreamed of. And the reason we never dreamed of them because we didn't even know what we were capable of. God shows up in our life and extends us the opportunity to reach and clutch onto him and hold on to him with everything we have. And suddenly we have the ability to produce fruit that we didn't even know was in us. I have a couple of questions to ask you this morning. We started our teaching time with a prayer, and in that prayer we asked for courage. And in particular, we ask for that every week, right? We end our prayer every week with the same thing. If we're going to do Bible study, we want those two things. We want to ask God for clarity. We want to ask God for courage. This morning, I'm going to close here in a few minutes with a couple of questions that for those of you who are married will probably be the greatest opportunity for you to use the courage that we pray for every single week. In fact, I'm not sure we've asked a question that requires more courage than the question we're going to ask here in a few minutes. And so I want to prepare you as we continue to march through this, just if you would revisit that prayer of courage, because I think we're going to need it. I'll read it to you again. Remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Let's talk about marriage. A healthy marriage begins with a healthy you. And so we're not going to ask the question, hey, is our marriage connected to Jesus? No. Now we're going to ask the question, are you connected to Jesus? Like that's where this begins. Are you personally connected to Jesus? Now, if you're sitting here thinking like, okay, well, I'm glad he's talking to the married folks. This applies to everybody, right? This applies to everybody. There's a word that growing up, it just, laziness on my end. I would hear people use this word, and I always thought it was a fun word. I was like, man, this is such a good word, but I never understood what it meant. Even in context, the context clues never really told me what it was. I'm positive that I've misused this word for so long. Until I got to high school, and finally I decided, you know what, I should probably look up what this thing means because I enjoy this word. Here it is. You ready? Serendipity. Isn't that a good word? Isn't that a good word? Man, everybody say it with me on 3. 1, 2, 3. Serendipity. Wow. Serendipity, an unplanned, fortunate discovery. An unplanned, fortunate discovery. Let me tell you about some serendipitous opportunities or moments. 1928, a guy named Alexander Fleming. He was a scientist in London. And he went on a vacation because everyone deserves a vacation from time to time, even scientists. And so he went on a vacation. He returns from vacation and he finds that some of his science experiments he did not clean up before he went. I don't know if he went on a last minute vacation, but for some reason things were not put back to the way they were supposed to be. And he just kind of left things out on the counter. And one of the Petri dishes in his lab had a mold that was growing on it. On closer inspection, he saw that the area around the mold had no bacteria. Serendipity. He just happened to find penicillin. No intention, just stumbled into it. Went on a vacation, and like a normal man, left a mess behind him. And he came back home. And this time, instead of getting in trouble for it, he unlocks like one of the greatest medical revolutions we have seen, right? Penicillin. There's a Swiss engineer, his name was George de Mestral. 1941, he was on a walk with his dog. And when they got home, he noticed that his socks and his dog were covered in these tiny little barbs from the cockerel plant. He started to look at it, put it under a microscope, and he started to see that these little barbs had tiny hooks on it, which snagged the loops of his clothing and his socks and his dog's fur. He was fascinated by it, and so he started to make his own version of this. In 1955, he patented what we know today as Velcro. Serendipity. Just happened to come across one of the most used inventions all over the world. Relationships can be serendipitous. It can be. I mean, you could be walking down the street and you see someone with the Braves hat on. And you say, hey, did you watch that game last night? And they're like, yeah, Acuna went 40 for 40. You know what I'm talking about? And you're like, we're best friends. That's right. Let's do the tomahawk chop together. Oh, right? That's what's happening, right? Or you're walking down the street and maybe you have the same shirt on. You're like, hey, so you shop at Walmart? Why shop at Walmart? You shop at whatever it is, right? You know what I'm saying? And in fact, I had, just the other day, I was coming out of the hospital and there was this guy who was in this really old Ford Taurus. There was tape all over the place, lots of tape. And I was walking and the guy looked at me and he goes, hey! And I looked over and I was like, you talk to me? He's like, yeah, you. And I was like, okay, all right. I'm not scared. Nope, I'm not scared. And I was like, yes, sir. He's like, where'd you get that hat? I had this hat on. And I was like, online? Why am I so nervous? I think he's gonna put me in the trunk. And I was like, I got it online. And he took his hat off, which his was a full camo hat. He had a full camo hat on and it said Georgia across the front of it. And he was like, you want to trade hats? And I was like, no. I just got this one. I just got it. If I thought he would give his life to Jesus when I traded, I would have traded it, okay? But I'm a little particular about my hats, you know what I'm saying? But all of a sudden, we went from like, hey, you're gonna put me in a box and hide me in the woods to, hey, we're friends, you know what I'm saying? Like we weren't best friends, but it just was a happenstance. Like relationships can be serendipitous, right? They can be. Healthy marriages are not serendipitous. They're not. Like you don't just wake up and just, our marriage is so great. Wow. How did this happen? I don't know. God is so good to us, we don't even have to work at it. That's just not it. No, healthy marriages are on purpose. On purpose. Picture yourself. You hop in a boat. You're going to go deep sea fishing. And you got this thing. You're like, you know what? I want to go so far where I can't see the land anymore. You know what I'm saying? Which some of you just went, whoop. You know what I'm saying? Like, can you go that far? Yeah, you can go that far. Right? You want to go so far. Like, I've never done that before. I want to go to where I can't see the shore anymore. And you get out there, right? You get out there and somebody takes the key out of the engine. And like, you know what? I think it'd be better if we just hope we get back to shore. Like, we definitely have the ability to crank the engine and to direct ourselves where we need to go. But I think I'd rather just put this in my pocket and just see what happens. And that's what we do in our marriages. Like, all of us have the ability to steer the ship where we need it to go. We have the keys, we can put it in, we can crank it up, we can have a steering wheel, we can do the whole thing, right? Like, we have the ability, we have the tools at our disposal to move our marriage towards being healthy. We can do that. But the truth is, most of the time, we get all the way out there in the deep, and then we take the keys out and it's like, nah, I think we'll just chance it. Let's just see what happens. And then we're surprised we're in Pirates of the Caribbean and the whole thing is going down the toilet in the middle of the Atlantic. You know what I'm saying? There's a guy named Paul. He was a church planter, wrote a significant portion of the Bible that we know today in the New Testament. And he's mentoring a guy that he just loves and cares for and adores. And he's trying to give him some advice about just being spiritually healthy. And I think his advice is really good. He says this in 1 Timothy 4:7-8. Have nothing to do with godless myths and old wives' tales. Rather, train yourself to be godly. For physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come. You know, there's a lot of churches in our country, a lot. Coming really close behind are the number of gyms in our country. Like, there's a lot of workout gyms, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's a ton of workout facilities. Now they're not all full, right? They're not all full. In fact, I haven't seen the inside of one of those things in quite a while, you know what I'm saying? But I probably could use some time. I could use some time, but who has time for the gym? You know what I'm saying? Who has time to do those things? In my mind, I have filled my schedule. right? I've got children, I have a wife, I have a job, I have the television. I've got things to do. You know what I'm saying? I got things to do. I got memes to send my friends from Instagram. I've got work to do. You know what I'm saying? But ask someone who goes to the gym regularly, who is like, you know what? I've got goals. I've got gym goals. Ask them what would happen if they didn't go for a month. Ask them how much they would lose for 4 weeks. Just say 4 weeks. It'd be enormous. Now, what I want you to hear is I am not in any way equating a Sunday morning gathering to regular gym. Because the truth is, your spiritual life relies much more on the 167 hours outside of a church gathering than it does the 1 hour you put in the building on a Sunday morning, right? Much more, right? In fact, you can come once a week here on a Sunday morning or any other church you want to, and you can still have a 0 on the spiritual health side of things, and you are here 52 times a week or 52 times a year, right? That is possible, you know what I'm saying? So I'm not equating the two. But what I am saying is that anybody who goes to the gym knows, like, hey, if I want to see progress, I've got to keep at it. Like, I can't just hope serendipity happens, that I'm just gonna do whatever I want, and the next morning I'm gonna wake up and look in the mirror and say, hey, good looking. That belly has disappeared. You know? Like, it just doesn't happen that way. And that's what Paul says. He says, hey, here's the deal. Physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things. In fact, he starts and he says, train yourselves to be godly. So I want to give you a small list of some spiritual disciplines. Just a really small, brief list of some spiritual disciplines that I just want to walk you through. If you're asking the question like, okay, God wants me to bear good fruit, got it? A good tree bears good fruit. And even though he doesn't give me all the specifics, I do know that if I attach myself to the vine, if I'm attached to Jesus, the outcome is going to be good fruit. If I'm legitimately attached to Jesus, I will produce good fruit. So let me give you just some examples of what some spiritual disciplines might look like for you just to consider. The first one is Bible reading. It's a really simple one. Right? For those of you in the room who are brand new to this attempt at faith, man, Bible reading is huge. For those of you who have been at this for decades and you've read a lot of the Bible and you've stopped reading the Bible because you've read most of it already, this also could be really huge for you. But I don't want you just to open the Bible just at random and say, well, let me just see. Most books we start with page 1. Let me go to page 1. There's nothing wrong with page 1. Genesis is a great book. But, you know, I would love if you just reached out and we could just have a little bit of a dialogue about, wait, what's going on in your life right now? Or what are you interested in learning a little bit more about? Are you brand new to faith and you're like, I just want to know about the life of Jesus? Like, where do I start reading? Because I started in Genesis and I thought maybe he'd show up in the second book, and I got to Exodus and didn't quite find Jesus there. And then I got to Leviticus and it was just awful, so I quit, right? So where's Jesus in this thing, right? Well, I would tell you, yeah, you should start with the book of Luke. You should start with the book of Luke. If you want to read a good bit about the life of Jesus, read the book of Luke. Or maybe if you're like, hey, you know, I actually want to read a lot about like the final week of Jesus, like the crucifixion and that whole thing. I want to dive into that. I would like to know more about the cross. I would tell you, let's go to the book of John and go to the back half of the book of John. And that's where we'll start. Or maybe you hear us talking about starting churches and you're like, I want to know more about where this is in the Bible. Like, how did the whole church planting startup thing, where did that happen? I would say, hey, let's go to the book of Acts. Or maybe you're like, you know what? I want to dive in deep with the whole story of and the theology, the deep, rich theology behind the rescue story of Jesus. And I really want to get into the whole idea of why God's done what he's done. We just want to read the first 11 books of Romans, right? Just the first 11 chapters of Romans. Man, you have to read it 3 or 4. It's so good. It's so good. Or maybe you're going through an extremely difficult time. And this is just one of those moments where you're like, I feel squeezed every day. And does the Bible give me anything with that? I say, yeah, let's read the book of James. Just a few chapters. It's so tiny. You read it in 15, 20 minutes, but it's got so much for what you're going through at this very moment. So Bible reading is a really simple spiritual discipline. The second one is Bible study. And so it's one thing for us to take the grace that's been given by our Bible translators, who take ancient language and put it in a way for us to understand in our own English. It's one thing for us to read through that. It's another thing to say, you know what, I think I want to go an even step further. I think I would like to read some really trusted, smart individuals that have taken some time to break this down even further for me, where they've taken their thoughts and their study, and we would call it a commentary. And maybe there's a commentary you were like, hey, I want to read that narrative about the resurrection, the crucifixion of Jesus. I want to read the crucifixion narrative, but I want to read it alongside someone who's much smarter than I am, their thoughts. Man, that's a more in-depth Bible study. Or maybe it could be Bible memorization. It's another one. In fact, we have this precedent that's set for us that in the midst of Jesus having a really difficult moment, that when he felt really squeezed, his response was what he had memorized from his own Bible reading and Bible study. And that's the way he responded out loud when he was going through a very difficult moment. And so maybe for you, it's figuring out, hey, what am I going through? What does God say about it? And could I spend so much time on it that I would memorize it? Or maybe it's the spiritual discipline of prayer. I think this one is really difficult because we have taught so many inside of the context of church that prayer is this very ornate, complicated, complex, lots of big words, and that you have to know all of these things about God in order to talk to God. But that's not what we find in the Bible at all. In fact, we find a completely different approach. But there's no harm intended when we had people over the last number of generations speak these incredible prayers. In fact, we can go read prayers of church fathers and people who were early in the faith that are very ornate and gorgeous to read. And there was no harm intended to it. But one of the byproducts of that very public display of prayer is it intimidates us to pray at all. And the way we describe prayer here at Foundation is your first step to pray is just to begin to think thoughts in God's direction. Like that starts that conversation. And you don't have to make up words you don't know. You can just use the ones that you have in your heart, that you're feeling inside of your heart and your brain, your mind. But maybe regular prayer is a spiritual discipline you need to take a look at. And the next one is giving. And this is a pretty advanced spiritual discipline. This is a really tough one because what you're saying is, hey, I collect funds and I'm going to take some of those funds and I'm going to use it for something that doesn't directly benefit me, right? I'm not going to purchase something in the store that I then use. I'm not going to purchase something that entertains me or whatever. I'm just going to simply give this away. And this is a really difficult one. And I want to make sure that you hear me on this. When I talk about a giving or a generous attitude, I'm not necessarily talking just about what you give or don't give when we take offering here. In fact, I'm very aware that there's a pretty big issue in terms of trusting a church with your money. And so I would say, hey, if that's the case, I would trust God with your money before you ever trusted Foundation with your money, which means that you should probably start with something you know is trustworthy. Find a nonprofit that you believe in that's helping solve a problem that's close to you, whether it's Bridging the Gap, who's just 2 blocks from here and helps those who are food insecure every single week. Or whether it's Coweta Forest, just across the street, that is one of the premier places in the state of Georgia for addiction recovery. And give to them. There are so many places that you can say, hey, I'm going to carve out a piece of what God has given me because it's a spiritual discipline to give. Beyond that, there's the idea of fasting. this is also a pretty difficult spiritual discipline. It's not one that typically starts right at the beginning. Fasting is a moment where you say, I'm gonna go without food. And in that place, instead of pursuing what I normally would during that time, I'm gonna pursue God in a completely different way than I typically approach him. We're gonna allow, let's just say we were to fast for a day for 24 hours, we're gonna allow the hunger that is created inside of us to be a reminder and a prayer that says, God, would you give me this same hunger for you that I feel for the meals that I'm missing? That I want to take that time that I would typically invest in myself, and I want to invest it in your direction and your thoughts and your ways. Maybe it's a Sunday gathering, being regular at Sunday gatherings, where you make a decision and say, hey, this is going to be a normal part of what we do. Maybe it's the discipline of silence, where you decide, I'm going to turn everything off so that I can hear God. Even if he whispers to me in the smallest, tiniest whisper, I want to be able to hear him, that I create that kind of silence in my life. Or maybe the last one I'll give you is rest. Rest. Where you would say, I'm going to set aside a piece of my week in advance. And I'm going to, a biblical term would be a Sabbath. I'm going to rest. I want you to do something for me real quick. If you would take out your phone, I want you to take a picture, because these are going to leave the screen, and your courage question is going to have to do with what's on the screen. And so I don't want you to forget what's on the list. So I'll give you just a second to take that picture. And then I want to get to the questions that I told you were going to require an enormous amount of courage. And every week, it's our hope that we are a catalyst for some thinking in your own spiritual life, whether it's very fully developed or whether it's just getting started. And so we want to be a catalyst for that. And so we like to ask questions. We like to make challenges for you to think through and see if you want to take it on. This is a question that I'm going to ask every single married person to ask, but I'm telling you, it requires an enormous amount of courage to ask it. So at some point today, I would like for you to ask your spouse, what one spiritual discipline do you think I should begin? And you got the list because you took a picture of it. What one spiritual discipline do you think I should begin? You see how much courage that takes? Here's the second question. What is one spiritual discipline we should begin together? What's one I should begin? What's one we should begin together? Now, this is why this requires a lot of courage. Because it's possible that if you're in a relationship, it's possible that spiritual health hasn't been a topic of any kind of conversation. That maybe the reason you came to church is because you wanted to get your kids involved in something, right? And like, I like for them to have some positive influence. I like the values, right? I mean, I think I can get on board the values that Jesus teaches, right? To love one another and be respectful. And I want my kids to hang around other kids that are also good kids. And so that's why we decided to go to church, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that being your beginning and that being the place that you begin. And so that might be the extent of your spiritual conversation. Or maybe you've had some other spiritual conversations when you're getting to know each other, but it was just like, yeah, I mean, I grew up in church, and so, yeah, we got this church that we go to in downtown, and so we go, and it's great, and whatever, and that's been the extent of it, and there's no other spiritual conversations that are happening. And so asking this might feel a little awkward. In fact, I can kind of feel and sense that it could be intimidating for a husband or a wife to even ask the question, because you might feel like you're disqualified because of maybe some things that you have been involved in or are currently involved in, where you would say, well, I can't really ask this question because of what went on Saturday night or Friday night, or what he actually knows or she actually knows I think about some whatever. And so I feel like I can't ask this question because I'm really not in a position to ask spiritual questions, right? No, let that go. Hold on to the courage that we've been praying for and say, hey, I'm going to have the courage to ask the question, even if I'm unqualified to ask such a question. I'm going to ask it because ultimately the question's not about you, is it? It's about week 1. And the two became one flesh. The two became one flesh. That's a big deal. I want to take this up a notch though. Now that we got the courage questions, I want to give you something, a gift to add on to the questions. They're going to help the conversation. So it's the same question. We're just going to add one more word onto the end of the question. What one spiritual discipline do you think I should begin? ? Follow it up with how? How should I begin this? That's the money. Because let's just say that you get the courage to ask this question. And let's say your spouse looks at you and says, I think you should figure out how to rest more. And then you're like, thank you. Wow. What a great answer. I knew I loved you for some reason. This is good. But then that's the end of the conversation, right? Or it's I think you should try reading the Bible. Okay, cool, thanks. But then it's just a one question, one word answer. No, so follow it up with, how do you think I should do that? Let's say, for example, that they say, you know what, I think when it comes to the question we should do together, let's say one of you says, I think we should give something away to a nonprofit or someplace that we trust. I think we should give something of what we do away, of what we make away. It can be okay, cool. But the better thing is, all right, well, how are we going to do that? Because the truth is, we've been spending everything we bring in anyway. Like every month, at the end of the month, like we're down to, we've spent everything. So if we're going to give, $100 or $200 or $300 or $500 to whatever nonprofit we're going to do, or give to the church, whatever it is, like how are we actually going to make that happen? Like that's a great idea, but now let's have a conversation. How do we pull it off? Or maybe it's, I don't think we rest together very well. And so we got to ask the question, well, how? Well, now we got to have a conversation about, our schedule's just full. Like every moment is just full to the brim, and there's no space to rest. And so now we have to have a conversation about, okay, if we're on the same page, how do we pull this off? How do we accomplish this? These questions require a ton of courage. But I think they're questions worth asking, because the questions are worth answering. That's a good one. Yeah. Yeah. I think you got to ask how. Like you don't get to start silence then. You know what I'm saying? I think you've got to ask some clarifying questions to say, all right, walk me through how you see this for me. How you know me better than anyone. How will this benefit me in a way that I haven't seen myself? And I think you might be surprised at the answer. Last week, I made an offer that no one took me up on. And so I want to make the offer again. It's an offer that we have made since we've started Foundation. We did 11 months of community engagement from February 2017 to January 2018 and started weekly gatherings January 2018. And we've made this offer from the very beginning because one of our values is healthy families. So last week, I said it out loud again. If your marriage is in a really difficult spot where you're feeling like, man, things are tense, they're not going well. our church wants to connect you with someone who lives, eats, sleeps, and breathes healthy families and marriage restoration. That we have really great partners who love Foundation, love the people in Foundation, and love to serve the people of Foundation, especially when it comes to marriage. And so if you're in that spot, we take part of what we gather in offering and we set aside money to pay for your first visit to go and see one of those counselors. And so if that's the hurdle, if the financial thing is the hurdle of, goodness, I don't know, reach out. Reach out. Nobody reached out last week. And so my thought is that the first time you hear that is you ought to, but it's scary sometimes to say, hey, we might need a little help. And it's okay. I'm not afraid of you being scared. You shouldn't be afraid of you being scared. That's a normal, natural thing. But I just feel like maybe there's someone who just needed a second opportunity. And you were thinking, you know what, I should have done it last week. I should have, because I know we could use a little bit of help. And you were thinking, I missed my opportunity. You didn't. Here's the sign that you should reach out this week. We would love to connect you and help make that happen financially for your first visit. I believe that you are worth it. I believe that y'all are worth it. And that your marriage is valuable. Not only to you and those who live in your household, I believe your marriage is valuable to our community.